My name is John Russell. My AIF number was NX3066. And I came to us, I was born in England, London, on the boundaries of London City Council and Surrey. So our house had two addresses. Could be 76 Queen's Road, Croydon, Surrey, or 76 Queen's Road, London, South East 27, same place, bombed during the war. I was number 4. My dad was in the Royal Engineers in the First World War, late coming back because they were clearing the rubbish from. He was a builder and an engineer. At a very young age, when I was still at Dulwich College Prep School, we had a magic lantern show of Shackleton's expedition in the Antarctic, you see. And I came out of that, one of these days I'm going to go to the Antarctic, you see. And Dad got real fed up with all this babble. My dad was a very patient sort of a man. And when kids had their scooter or billy cart damaged, he'd show them how to fix it. You know, not fix it for them, show them how to fix it. Anyway, he said to me, why don't you write to Lady Shackleton? Because Shackleton had died in South America. So I did. And she said that the idea of future expeditions was not dogs or donkeys, but aircraft and tractors. She said, so future Antarctic explorers will have to be engineers who know how, not only how to fix a machine, but its technical aspects. That's what I set out to be. When I was on Dunbar Castle as a ship at sea, the Union Castle line in those days were gradually changing over their ships to motor ships and steam and trying to recruit people to train on the motor ships. So I came to Australia in 1938 because the Australian government had agreed with the UK that Australia would take over all the claims of the United Kingdom in the Antarctic, except that little bit to South America, because the UK wanted to make sure they kept that channel open between the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. So I came here in 1938 and started first year at Sydney. The population in Australia in 1938 was about 7 million people. Sydney University was only one university in New South Wales, Sydney. It was scheduled, organised for a total of 3,000 students. There was a Catholic college, a Protestant college, and a girls' college at the back. And before the first year session was out, Menzies one Sunday morning in Sydney, I think it was the 3rd of September 1939, announced by radio, we didn't have television in those days, announced by radio that we were then at war with Germany. And it took about a month or 6 weeks of argument in Canberra before any Australians were recruited. And then they were recruited as a 20,000 expeditionary force to keep the Suez Canal open, as they did in the First World War. But people who were doing an engineering study at the tech school or at the university were exempt, and people who were working or were fitters and turners and machinists and that sort of thing were out of it, weren't, because we were just getting out of depression years. But the 30,000, 20,000 men that were finally recruited were going to go to Suez, and there were ships in the harbour waiting to take them there. But this was in 1940, was it? Yes. Towards the end of 1940, when out of the sky off Honolulu at 4 o'clock in the morning on the 7th of December, the Japanese almost entire Air Force bamboozled Pearl Harbor and wrecked all their shipping in that harbour because the Japs wanted to make sure that they had no opposition in the Pacific Ocean. They made a bad error there, but still, when I asked a Yank how was it that Pearl Harbor, for 5 miles across my road from Honolulu, was unscathed, he said, "Son, because half of our population are Japs." So, back in Australia, the Antarctic Division had been announced, and Australia had actually bought a ship from Lincoln Ellsworth for £4,000, believe it or not, to go to the Antarctic. But the Navy had taken this to Sydney and into the dry dock, and that's where it was when the war started. So the war interfered with the Antarctic preparations, and I joined up in Sydney because I got in because I had an actual car driving license. It was only about 6 months. I got it on Saturday morning, so I could drive a car at weekends. I was doing it for a hospital. And they needed drivers, so I got into the 2nd AIF, which was then called the Special Expeditionary Force, until a Labour Party bloke who was named Eddie Ward, very strong trade union representative of the waterside workers, had a stand at Sprucer's Corner in Hyde Park on Sunday afternoon. And there were a few people in the audience who were just being issued with army uniforms or Air Force, ex-Force World War I stuff out of the store. And he pointed at these fellows and said, you and you, the traitors to Australians, enemies of the working class, etc. So I go back to Ingleburn, which was the recruiting camp then, told their story. And our sergeant came in. We always used to put him out down as a chunky sort of a bush bloke, because he was sunburned and an ex-militia man. The militia to join into the Special Expeditionary Force had resigned from the militia, but he came in and it became our sergeant. When he heard this story, he said, "Oh, goodness me." And he goes down back to the office and on the telephone, comes back and he says, "Look, I want as many of you fellas as possible to go down to Hyde Park next Sunday, and if this fellow is screaming about us being a traitors to Australia, I'll blow my whistle 3 times and we'll go and smash his stand." This is what happened. And just nearby, there's the Hyde Park tea rooms, the only place that had a bit of bitumen on the ground in front. So they burned his stuff there in the Hyde Park tea room. Next morning, Sydney Morning Herald on the Monday says, truth right in Hyde Park. But the tea room fellow who leased the building from Sydney Council painted out the sign with tea room, Hyde Park tea room, and we painted it, called it Anzac Buffet. And it's still called the Anzac Buffet today. So that's how the second AIF came into being. It becomes a long, complicated story now in the AIF. Small units being formed, and we moved up to, or a handful of us were moved up to a camp at Rutherford near Maitland to form a special unit to handle munitions or something. Our camp at Rutherford, which is about 2 miles from West Maitland, was supplied by the West Maitland Railway Service. The horse and the cart painted up in First World Wars. And then they got a couple of sheds built in, assembled in Natcherville, I think, in Sydney, painted grey. And there were, half the camp was getting Christmas leave, like piled into the back of the truck, just sitting in the trucks, you know. I went up the hill and around a very sharp left-hand turn with the road camber that was wrong. And the truck went over, and men were thrown out, and 2 men were killed when the truck came down on them. And I was, because I'd done the drills in school beforehand, I had a six little team down by the store hut teaching them reverse arms rest. When one of them says, "Hey, Corporal," I think I was a corporal then, I was only a boy. I said, "What?" He said, "Look behind you," and there's these 2 fellas in smart uniforms, red tassels, on horseback. And one of them came right up to me, he said, "What's this, the awkward squad?" I said, "No, we're practicing reverse arms rest." "What for?" So we told him. He said, "I can't have that." So he goes up to the office, and that was the end of the special function that was to be held at, in Maitland for these 2 blokes who had been killed. And we were then moved from Rutherford to Cowra in New South Wales, where another military camp had just been established outside of the town. We were then 50 of us, 50 Army Service Corps blokes, all drivers, attached to the 2nd 12th Field Ambulance, which was being formed at Cowra. Just over the hill from us was the 2nd 12th Machine Gun Battalion. Well, a train came in and hauled all the 2nd 12th Field Ambulance people away, because in Melbourne, the Army's council or something had decided we were unprotected in the Northern Territory, and the Japs were getting boisterous, you see. So they formed an organisation called the Darwin Overland Mobile Force, DOMF. We were 50 Army Service Corps men attached to the 2nd 12th Field Ambulance, were to be transported to Darwin to form a protective unit there. In 1939, 1940, we had the old Gann train, a 3-foot 6-inch rail, running from Broken Hill to Alice Springs. Beyond Alice Springs, there were no roads, no rail, only the overhead telegraph line going to a cable that went undersea eventually. And it was the wet season. No four-wheel drives could handle the wet season there. And we were camped at Alice Springs. Typhoid fever broke out. And I was one of the victims. And eventually, after investigation, they found that the fellows who went down with typhoid had all been having milk drinks or cocktail drinks or soft drinks at a little Chinese place where they didn't boil the water beforehand. You were in the pub, boil the water. Anyway, just before my unit got attached to an artillery mob that came through, which had four-wheel drive tractors towing a 25-pound cannon. They were going to make the road up to Darwin, and our unit was moving out. At the time, I was in the typhoid quarantine area, and the sergeant came down and said, "Joan, we're off. In the morning, you better hurry up and get well." Instead of that, I got worse. I finished up with a ruptured gangrenous appendix, which was operated on by the Flying Doctor Hospital at Alice Springs. And I was eventually, after 6 or 8 weeks there, put back on the train to come back to Adelaide to recuperate. Instead of recuperating, I had a lot of trouble with the spine, and eventually that was diagnosed in Concord Hospital in Sydney, which in those days was just a military hospital. I had a tumour on the spine, and they explained to me that these tumours were formed by people who have a severe fever condition on the blood. Could be even influenza, because in the blood stream flowing through the body to counteract the fever, you get these antibodies forming. And sometimes the antibodies grow bigger, and when the fever is cleared, you've got an antibody that is a foreign body forming in the body, and they form on knuckles and things like that. In my case, it was on the 9th thoracic nerve on the spine and paralysed me from the waist down. And it was Concord in Sydney, which was then a military hospital, found this tumour and eventually removed, by which time this leg, which was already damaged, this one wouldn't work at all. I had to learn to walk again through the bars. But they kicked me out of there second day. I didn't want half-fit fellows who were half-fit. And within about a month, I was on the crew of the Aquitania, because we had ships in the harbour waiting to take 20,000 men to the Suez Canal. And 35 members of the Aquitania was one of the ships there. 35 men on that ship's crew hadn't had leave for nearly 2 years, but they're all married men, their families in Manchester, all that sort of place. Ship going straight to Liverpool, so they got aboard and recruited 35 Aussies. That's why I've got this badge. I said, because the fellows in Australia, you volunteered for their services, but were knocked back for various reasons. They'd issue you with a little silver badge so that people in the tram or the bus, the women particularly, say, "Why aren't you in your uniform?" You see. They say, "Well, look, I volunteered and they knocked me back." So you get these little silver badges. And in the UK, where half the population was ocean-going seamen anyway, they issued those badges. And the 35 Aussies who joined the Aquatonian eventually got these badges. Very rare in Australia. They just sent it to me. Whereas these, you know. In fact, there's a medal there. That's the polar medal. I think this one was issued to civilians during the Second World War who worked for and with and the head of our troops, building accommodation and roads and so on. So that's a civilian helpers medal, because they were bombed and... So that's the sort of story. Immediate post-war years, I go back to New Guinea. I was in New Guinea a while during the war. And I go back to New Guinea to set up technical schools to train the boys, or the young fellas, who'd helped us during the war. Fitters and turners and all that sort of thing. And eventually, I got a telegram was phoned to me. I was at a place called Horo, Western New Guinea, preparing for oil drilling. And the field manager in Port Moresby said, "Hey, John, I got a telegram here. I think it's for you." He said, "It comes from Melbourne, and it's signed by a fellow named Trevor something or other." I said, "Well, I don't know the name." What's it say? It says, "You're hereby appointed Engineer Antarctic Division. Please report to Melbourne, SAP." This was near Christmas, 1940. And I said, "Well, we're finished here, we're waiting for the drilling crew." He said, "Well, the Catalina, we used to get our food supplies in on the Catalina, just dropping in the river. We were living in tents." And he said, "Well, the boat's on its way, John, and as it's Christmas time, you can come back in the boat," and so on. So I did. Eventually I arrived in Melbourne, where the Antarctic Division was then formed, and found that the Antarctic Division had one of the huts in Albert Park Barracks that had been put there during the First World War, and that's where we started work on the Antarctic Division. So that, we set up Macquarie Island. Our ship was run by the Navy, and it had been built, we're not quite sure whether it was built in Tassie or in England or in some other place, but it was a standard all-world ship, and they used to call them, I've forgotten what they called them. They were about a 10,000-ton displacement, and they had the bows arranged through hydraulics and mechanics, so that these ships could run themselves ashore and open the bows and be unloaded direct onto the islands. Didn't always work, but that was the idea of it. Landing ship tank, LST, that's right. And this one was called the LST-3501. Had also been named by the Navy HMAS Labuan, one of the islands. Anyway, yes, that ship did a great job establishing Macquarie Island base. And next year it established Heard Island base. And Then eventually the government had put up enough money and told us that we could establish a base on the Antarctic continent, but it's got to be on a permanent position, not just on the ice. And the only permanent place we could find from photographs that Group Captain Campbell had taken before the war was this particular area, which would say almost due south of Perth. And it was called Horseshoe Harbour, and had a fairly narrow entry from the ocean into a harbour place where there was 2 or 3 little dots of islands and a fairly large shelving of dark-coloured rock coming out of the ice plateau into the sea. And that was a very, very rare sort of a thing, where you could get what appeared to be the actual land of the Antarctic continent running gently down into the sea. Not as it is on that painting up there, where the ice crashes down might be several hundred or a couple of thousand feet and disperses into the sea. So we headed for that particular place to establish a place which we called Mawson. And somewhere around here there are photographs of that particular slope, dark brown land rock, where it floats right down into the sea from the ice above. And that photograph there is on just north of the New Zealand base. In the distance of that photograph, where you see the smoke or the steam coming up, that's the volcano. And that volcanic peak there is where a flight, an aerial flight from New Zealand on a 747 ran into the volcano. It blew the aircraft into smithereens, and all passengers and everybody was killed or frozen because they hadn't reset the altimeters in Auckland before they'd taken off. And so the pilot there was reading incorrect figures with a total blackout, or not a blackout, it's a whiteout. Very peculiar situation. You can still get it here. Aircraft here now fly. If the sky, instead of being blue out there now, was covered in a misty sort of a white, that's a whiteout. And you don't know whether up or down or how. When you're in it, unless you've got some guidance, you just get totally lost. So our living quarters that were established at Heard Island often had whiteouts. So to get from the living quarters to the powerhouse, there was a rope line, and you just put your arm around the rope and just pulled it down. But that was the only substantial air crash known in the Antarctic. I should have mentioned, because it's a very important part of my life, on the 19th of December 1953, I married a 10-pound pom by the name of Joan, and this was the third girl I'd been engaged to, but this time we got married. And that was on the 19th of December 1953. On the 4th of January 1954, we sailed away to establish this Antarctic base, which we did at Mawson. So 15 months later we come back, and I'm leaning on the rail, and in Melbourne the ships can come right up to the city and the river, and I had right beside me a good old mate who had been with a couple of other bases, and then Macy from Coogee, radio man. And I said, oh look, then there's your wife over there, Peggy. He said, yes, hi Peggy. I said, I wonder who that good-looking girl standing beside Peggy is. But, says Lem, is your wife, John. So my wife, Joan, was my wife, and a wonderful woman too, for 59 years, and died eight years ago in Redcliffe Hospital, cancer and one other problems. And my daughter, who was very close and is very much like my wife, my only child incidentally, Susan, is here looking after me now. So there we are, the Antarctic work, and the odd thing is, and the days that I was with the Antarctic Division, before it moved to Hobart, many and most of the fellows volunteering and wanting to go south were ex-servicemen. They used to working 24 hours a day if necessary, without overtime and so forth. And the deals that we had with the Antarctic Division, we worked 7 days a week on our own particular program. The only fellow who had time off was the cook, and the cook had Saturday afternoon and Sunday off, so every other member of the team takes a turn at being the slushy to take over the weekend cook. That's the way it used to work. Whether it still goes that way, I don't know. But that was the major, when I was with the Yanks at McMurdo as a specialist for engineer. They chased me and my wife. I said to Joan, we were living at the very presently, I was working with BP then in technical sales, and we were living at WWII Beach, which is halfway between Sydney and Palm Beach. And I said to Joan, look, they want me, Joan, and they're $10,000 a year, everything provided, which was about more than double the pay I'm getting with BP when I was field man. I said, I'll buy you a television set. So I bought her a television set, coloured, Stromberg cars, and the cabinet just inside there, filled with all sorts of old junk now. Anyway, Joan was a wonderful wife for 59 years. And it was really Joan's determination that moved us from New South when I left BP to Queensland, and we bought a property at Curra, up near Gympie. Anyway, Joan started to get very ill. The hospital at what's the hospital near Gympie? Yeah. Couldn't get satisfactory, so that I had to take Joan to somewhere else to get. And then they sent us down to Redcliffe to get proper. And that's where they diagnosed Joan's problem, and eventually had one breast removed. But it was 40, you say, about 2 hour drive, an hour and a half, 2 hour drive from Curra to Redcliffe. So I went around the agency, can we find me some place to rent? And in finding the place to rent, we found a place to buy, moving in. And you walk down the road and you're in the shopping centre and down to the beach. And so we were there for a long time until the council decided that 3-storey houses could be built there. And So Joan said, that's no good to me. We left that because we then had a property at Kilcoy, only 3 or 4 acres just outside. Had a first steel framed house built there, insulated, double glazed windows and one thing and another. Very comfortable. And I then started to have trouble with my teeth and my jaw. We didn't have a dentist. A doctor came once a week, one day a week, and he's messing about here. And he said, John, he said, it's not a broken tooth, you know. He said, what your trouble is, you've had fillings done during the war with the mixture which is mercury. And you've got mercury poisoning under the filling, and that's now eating, dissolving the gum, the jawbone. He said, the only way you can fix it, you have to have all your teeth removed. And Caboolture Hospital has a dental unit. 2 years waiting list. Yeah! But the local doctor that I was attending to, Nick Kilcoy, or his offsider, who was a Scottish girl, she rang the local MP and said, look, we've got this bloke and so and so and so. He's an ex-army, an ex-merchant navy, but he hasn't any post-war services medically. Did two courses at Sydney University and Armidale University under the, what they call, repatriation they used to call it. Anyway, this resulted in the MP, Peter Slipper, was his name. I don't know which party he was, but he organised it so that I was now attached to what became the Department of Veterans Affairs. And now I get all my medical looked after. I've had cancer removed behind this ear and behind this ear, 2 different times. 4 or 5 days in hospital, this one. And the local branch of the RSL, I've been with the RSL since the 50s. The local branch of the RSL got a vehicle and they're looking for reason to use it. So I said, well, how about a weekly shopping trip? So they take me shopping every Tuesday. And now I have my daughter here as well. I'm well looked after. Well, I think personal, meeting Joan and meeting her as a wife, I think that was the most significant to me. Worldwide, or Australia-wide, I think was the most stupid thing we've ever done. That was to go metric, you know, totally unnecessary. The United States still sells petrol by the gallon. They still do business, pounds, shillings and pence, or dollars and cents. I think it was getting to a stage where our population was growing quite considerably, especially with these 10-pound POM families, and we were establishing scientific base. In New South Wales, the Armidale Teaching School became a university, University of New England or something. The little sort of homegrown University of Adelaide, which was a tight-fitting one, grew to a massive split. It's been established 100 years. Melbourne University established Murdoch or something like that too. Perth even established a university way up there. And our road transport, one of the reasons why Perth is now what it is, there's a story there about how Perth grew. Go back 40 or 50 years, and petrol in Queensland came from refineries in New South Wales and Victoria. There was a proposal to establish a refinery around Brisbane. To do that, we needed to have a decent sort of a deep water port. The possibility had existed for a while. The Tweed River running out at Tweed Heads created a whole mass of soft land there, because the bar formed when the lightweight fresh water hits the seawater and drops it. So the argument went up between New South Wales and Queensland when old Joe was in the chair to dredge that river, get rid of that bar, so the deep water, deep-keeled ships, tankers, could come right up the river and establish. Well, that was done to some extent, but it dried out Tweed Heads. Now, Tweed Heads, instead of being a bar, it's got retirement homes and so on. But the publicity that was stretched. See, we have only one refinery still in Queensland now, run by Celtics, which is California, Tasmania, and California, Mexican oil company. But Western Australia woke up. They had anything, the washing machines and all that sort of thing were made in Melbourne or Sydney, transported all cost a small fortune to transport goods to Perth. So the Perth City Council said, you know, why can't we have a refinery here? You haven't got a decent deep water shipping. You've got this little wharf and it's wooden anyway. So they dredged Coburn Sound. Coburn Sound's a deep water. They've got a refinery. They've got the bitumen they've cut instead of, you know, the roads around Perth are concrete, but outside, bitumen. So tourist establishments where there just used to be a pearling industry up there, Broome is now, you know, a great town. So it's made a great difference to the economy of Perth and Western Australia. Came about by not dredging that river, but they dredged the river here anyway, and the company that Joan used to work for in Sydney, Lend-Lease, was very much involved in that sort of work. They were looking for land outside of New South Wales, and when that river, Tweed River, was dredged, provided the land started to dry out, all the debris for the dredge was built up on the land, and now Lend-Lease bought a lot of that land and high-rise, so forth. So the story's all written there. But that's going beyond what we hear here. But it's been an interesting 100 years, shall we say. I never wrote the story Antarctic Engineer for publication, It was Phil Law when he was the boss cocky of the Antarctic work. Look, you fellows are away. We had no radio telephones, you see. If you do your job, and we do the logbooks right up them, but what you should do every week or so is write a little story to your wife. You won't get it for a year, but there it is. So that's how I wrote the information, which eventually was, Susan was sitting in that chair there one weekend, reading the Courier Mail. She said, "Oh, look, Dad, they've got a flight from, Antarctic flight from Brisbane, so-and-so, on the 19th of January, her birthday." So I said, "Would you like to go?" "Oh, would I?" she said. So I said, "Well, you make the arrangements and I'll pay them." So she got onto the firm in Melbourne, and when she told the story, instead of having to pay $2,000 a seat, I think we got them for a negligible sum, and we got the seats up on the pilots, you know, the 16 seats on the top floor, with the galley right behind us, providing I would talk to passengers on the way. So we did. No people, they over the public address system, you know. So they were coming up. Sue and I sitting there chatting away. But it was very interesting. Oh, yeah. Well, you know the Yanks suffered a major, didn't I mention that? They blasted Pearl Harbor, yeah. Well, the Aquitania was the first ship going to Honolulu after Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor was the 7th of December, and we got there to about the 12th of December. I sailed directly from Perth. The Aquitania always sailed on its own, no escort. But the cruising speed was 28 knots, and it could do about 35 miles an hour. So that's too fast for submarines to line up their torpedoes. And so it went through 2 world wars, the Aquitania, without a scar. It was like a wrecking yard that had caught fire and exploded. The entire buildings, the ships, some, you know, sort of half in the water, stern, bow, ripped apart. It was just a shocking mess. You couldn't really accept that all these big Navy ships, there wasn't one that was seaworthy, because the Japs had almost entire their forces come in from aircraft carriers. And at dawn, and oddly enough, the very early radar stations that Australia had established had picked up these operations where there seemed to be Japs building up a big fleet, and they passed the information to the Yanks. The Yanks didn't accept it. I thought it was Sunday morning. Whoa, Sunday morning. And I did have one or two photographs, but I only had that little pocket folding camera, you know, where they've got to, I don't know. What have we got any? Have we? Of the smash-up ships? No. Oh, the Aquitania. Yeah, I've got a shot of the Aquitania taken from the Golden Gate Bridge. There's the Aquitania going out to sea. But the odd thing is that the 30 odd Aussies that formed part of the Aquitania's crew. The fellow from we didn't have an embassy in San Francisco, we had just a consulate. He came to us and he said, look, you fellas, I know they want to keep you signed on to the Aquitania, but if you do, you come under British wartime regulations. And it's not, so in those days, seamen would sign on voyage to voyage. So your voyage might be a month, might be 6 weeks, then you have a few days off and sign back on again. But during the war, there were just 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right throughout the year. And if you're lucky, you might get 2 or 3 days off. But this fellow from the Australian Consul Office said, and we're going back now to a 7 million population. We didn't have a road, we didn't have a bitumen road between Melbourne and Sydney, let alone Brisbane and Sydney. That's for. And this fellow came to us and said, look, he said, we need you in Australia. After all, in that time, interstate transport was shipping. Little ships, you know, ships that were built. There was a little shipping factory, built timber ships and steel ships at Fairfield or Ingleburn, I've forgotten the name of the actual area there, on the Parramatta River. But we built the ships here, some of them steamships, most of them motor ships. But that was our transport around Australia. And this fellow said, well, we need you, you know. Anyway, we got paid. Those are some, I know the ship's carpenter, who came from Cronulla, he was about 45 years old. He stayed with the Aquitania, went off sailing wherever it went. And I had a little tiny cabin, 2 bunks, and the upper bunk was what they call it, came from Melbourne. He was an electrician, about the same age as me. I've forgotten what he called him now, I had a nickname. I came into the office, still on the ship, it was in San Francisco, and he's down there trying to pack a case. I said, what are you packing for? I thought you were staying with the ship. He said, no, he said, I've signed up with the Yanks. I'm going to the girls' place now. To finish the wiring of the log cabins, you see. Never saw him again, I don't know what happened to him. The other one, the carpenter, stayed with the Aquitania, and I suppose he spent the war years on the Aquitania, came back. He came from Cronulla. The rest of us, the fellow from the consular office said, every Monday morning I'll come down and I'll bring you wages, you'll be paid whatever your job was on the Aquitania, you'll get the same rate of pay, and we'll provide you with a bed and breakfast at our expense, you see. It was actually a shipping expense. But it said, just Monday mornings. So these two, the carpenter and the electrician, who got tangled up with these girls, oh yes, this is subsequent to Honolulu. See, Honolulu is really like a holiday resort from the Navy. But about 10 miles away is Wake Island, and that was for the lower deck, you know. And on Wake Island, there was a brothel which was called Mamie Stover's House. Mamie Stover, something like that, yeah. And it was a huge revolving clockwork platform. Took 10 minutes to go around. fellas come in, $5 or 5 bob or whatever it was. Take your boots off, you go around and the thing does a circle, you get back, put your boots back on, off you go. You want another boot for cost you another $5. Anyway, because the island was being shut down because of the Japs, we took a lot of these people back to San Francisco on the Aquitania. These two particular girls got onto the carpenter and the electrician. And then there was no transport out there. Redwood City is 40-odd miles from San Francisco. So they came to me. I was the only bloke there with a driving licence, an Australian driving licence. And the carpenter it was, he said, we've already inquired of the cops. We'd have to do 7 days practice and this sort of thing to get a licence. He said, but your licence is acceptable here, your car licence. You got to show it to the cops. In the back of a photograph album, I've got the remains of a speeding ticket which is issued. We took these blokes to the girls' place, and then the other fellows said, look, why can't we go down to Hollywood and have a look at the filmmaking business, you see, 400 miles south. They hired the car. I think it was a Studebaker. We got Studebaker car hire. They hired it and paid for the petrol. And if we stopped it, they didn't have motels, and they used to have cottage rooms or family overnight cottages sort of thing, you know, that would cater for a family. So we stopped at those sometimes. Anyway, we go down to Los Angeles and stayed in the YMCA there. And they said, wanted to go to Paramount Studios. The fellow at the gate said, no. I said, I can't let you in. You have to have someone who's performing here, a staff member or something. And we got on to this fellow, whose name I can't remember, because he was well known as an Australian. He had a particular tone of voice and speech. But when I got on to him and speaking on the phone, he said, you know, John, he said, I'm not really Australian. He said, sure, I'd lived in Australia for many, many years, but I was born in South Africa. He said, but he said, I've got this peculiar voice, which both the Yanks and the Aussies think are right. That's why I'm here in Honolulu. Claude Rains, or something his name was. During the war, once the Japanese had dropped a few bombs and so forth on it, everything in Darwin was wrecked and ruined. At the time, they were building a new post office building, which was not just a post office, sorted the mail and everything. That became our workshop. We had to scrounge around to find corrugated iron of the wood. The rest of the building's concrete blocks. Have windows like that, but no glass in them. But it's perfectly all right as far as the workshop's concerned. The only, at the time, a new hotel was being built on the cliff top, overlooking the bay, and that was just a makeshift, I think the footing, that's about all there. On the other corner was the Commonwealth Bank, and a rounded shaped building, brick and concrete, and it was the only bank operating in Darwin. The banking, it doesn't matter if it was Bank in New South Wales or whatever, you could do it there. The only other building that seemed to be functioning in Darwin itself was operated or run by the equivalent of the YMCA. You know, they put on films and shows and a cup of tea and that sort of thing. Just outside the town itself, the Darwin Hospital had been extended, the timber and so on, and nurses there, but there were very few pedestrians. There were no pedestrians, no civilian population at Darwin. They were Army, Navy, Air Force, and the hospital staff.